So, Secretary of State, I just want to start on the issue of strikes, given it's very topical today, and the UK workforce. You recognise, presumably, that the size of the workforce in the UK has been shrinking for some time?
Yes, in terms of the number of people who are active participants, if that's what you mean.
Yes. So, in particular, as I understand it from the ONS, there have been around 200,000 people aged 50 to 64 that have left the labour market between quarter 4 2019 and quarter 4 2021. That's quite a high number of people leaving the labour market, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I think the dates that you mentioned are obviously revealing in themselves because it's related to the coronavirus outcome, which is that some people haven't returned to work afterwards. We're obviously very interested in making sure there are opportunities for all, and with a labour market which is as tight as it is at the moment, 3.6% unemployment, historically low since 1974, there's obviously opportunities there for people perhaps to re-enter the marketplace, and it is something that we're interested in working with DWP and others to try to assist with.
Yes, because the economic inactivity rate, so the number of people that are not working, is around 22%, which I understand is a record high. And about 100,000 of that 200,000 50 to 64-year-olds that have left the labour market have left for ill health, but the other 50% have left for other reasons. Presumably you recognise that in a cost of living crisis, there being fewer people to do all the jobs that we have, there's pressure on pay.
I think that's true. I think just in reference to those figures, I noticed you cited them up to 2021, middle of, I think. And I know anecdotally from speaking to employers that what people are finding is with the increased costs of living, particularly through the Putin-induced increased costs of energy, people who perhaps had exited the marketplace, the workplace, are in some cases looking to come back. I don't think that would be revealed in the figures that you've got in front of you there. I think that's very interesting. And obviously it is putting all sorts of pressures on the employment workforce. It's one of the reasons why the level of automation is particularly interesting as well.
And you recognise that there's a particular pressure in terms of public sector pay. I think from the ONS today, they've said private sector pay growth has been about 7%, and it's about 3% in the public sector. So it's reasonable, isn't it? The public sector workers are conscious about their pay levels.
So I think, kind of interestingly, if you look over a longer period of time prior to this morning's figures, I remember seeing a set of figures, sorry, I have to reference them separately, but that showed that private sector pay had gone up about 4%. I didn't have a figure for the public sector. I suspect it depends on the time period that you look after, and I'll get the committee those numbers. I think, look, everyone is under pressure, clearly, and inflation, which is induced by Putin's illegal war, is the reason. There's no mystery for that. It's pushed up in energy prices and massively pushed up inflation as a result. I just see before coming in here the US inflation figures have come out today and show that the rise has started to descend, or continued its descent, I should say, in the last month. And I very much hope we are in that position in Europe for long as well, as the impact of Putin's fuel-based war leads through the system. And then, to come back to your point, on pay, we see that's where the pressure for pay increases is coming from. The level of inflation, which is in no small part deduced from the cost of energy.
It would be wrong, though, wouldn't it, to blame President Putin for everything? I'm not here to defend him, clearly, but if we look at economic growth in the UK, since 2015, excluding the obvious problems with the COVID pandemic, we've had half a decade of economic decline, haven't we?
Look, again, you're selecting particular figures. I could give you another figure. Since 2010, the UK has enjoyed the third fastest growth in, I think, the G7, faster than, for example, Germany and France and Japan. So I think it really depends where you set those figures from. But I think it is, of course, true to say that Putin is responsible for the very, very high levels of inflation that the West has experienced, which is essentially an energy shock.
Well, the figures that I'm looking at are from the Office for National Statistics. I'm just talking about...
You just used a different base, so you used 2015, I used 2010.
well, I've got them from 2011 onwards, so I can go through each year if you'd like me to. But the numbers I have from the Office for National Statistics, in fact, let me do that as you've invited me to do so. There were only 4 years between 2010 and before the pandemic where there was a positive annual change in economic growth. 2012, 0.01%. 2013, 0.42%. 2014, 1.1%. And in 2019, 0.02%. But since 2015, there has been a consistent year-on-year decline in economic growth as a percentage of GDP. These are government figures. Do you dispute them?
Again, it depends on the baseline when you use those figures. I haven't got a set of numbers, but we can trade them, if you like, via letter. But for example, this year, we've had the fastest growth in the G7. So, we can. I'm not sure it adds much to sort of trade these figures backwards and forward. If your central argument that you might reach here is that productivity isn't what we want it to be in this country, I completely agree with you, and I think you'll find a lot of common ground. And I think I also see, although my tenure in this role is new, I think I can also see ways to improve our productivity quite dramatically as a country, and I think that is very much in our national interest.
Just to be clear, it's our job in this committee to measure your performance as a government, and I'm just using government figures here that are available. There's no trading.
As I say, not to put too fine a point on it, it depends which figures you quote. The figure that I quoted is also accurate, that we've had the third fastest growth in the G7 over since 2010. I think the figure is faster than Germany, France, Japan. I haven't got any of the numbers in front of me today for this committee, but I think though if your central point is wouldn't it be nice if we grew faster, I think we all agree, and I think productivity is at the heart of that.
Yeah. But my point here is you keep comparing us to other countries. I'm just interested in your government's performance here in the UK. And what I'm trying to put to you, based on the government figures, which are just the government figures, there are no dispute about the figures here, is that since 2015 we've had a period of economic decline, not economic growth.
Yes, the Office of National Statistics isn't the government. It's not us publishing our homework. That's an independent statistical office, of course. As I say, people will be watching this, will be familiar with both the pandemic and a war in Europe, which will have had an impact. And as I say, it slightly depends on when you start and end the numbers.
The pandemic and the war in Europe didn't start in 2015 when we started this period of economic decline. But let me move on to business investment, because one of the issues around economic growth is, of course, the investment the private sector makes in our economy, as well as the government and what people spend. And again, I've got these figures here, which are not just the Office for National Statistics, but the Office for Budget Responsibility as well. You may want to refute their figures, but let me just tell you what they say.
I'm not refuting any of these figures.
I've not asked you a question yet, Secretary of State, if you bear with me. So from 2015 to the year before the pandemic, private sector investment went from 9.3% up in 2015 compared to 2014, down to 0.9% in 2019. Again, half a decade of economic decline. What's your observation of those figures?
My observation is that you're selectively picking figures which don't disagree with the narrative that I'm presenting to you, which is, of course, we want our productivity to be much faster. But as I've already demonstrated in the figures that I presented back to you, and I won't repeat them for a third time, it really does depend on the start and the end date, because we didn't get to the third fastest growth in the G7 in the last 12 years by using your particular set of figures, but by using the same statistical analysis, I can demonstrate the opposite. I'm not sure it adds much to the sort of wealth of knowledge in the room.
If you refute the figures from the Office for National Statistics...
I don't refute the figures, as I said before. I'm simply questioning your specific start and end dates as opposed to mine.
Okay. First of all, please don't interrupt me, because it's rude and it's inappropriate. Second, let me finish asking my question, please. So my first question was, if you don't believe the figures from the Office for National Statistics and the Office for Budget Responsibility, whose figures are your comments based upon, just so I can check them for reference?
First of all, I'll write back to the committee with the set of figures that I've been talking about that show that our growth is the third fastest since 2010 in the G7. I've already mentioned it's faster than Germany, France, and Japan. And secondly, I have always thought in a select committee the purpose was to have a debate backwards and forwards.
No, it's to answer my questions, in which case you should let me finish asking the question. Just to make reference to other countries, as you seem to wish to do, based on the OECD figures, among the G20, apparently it's only the United Kingdom that will have a smaller economy in 2025, based on current projections, than any other G20 country from before the pandemic. Why do you think that is?
Because, as I say, you're throwing figures at me. When I respond, for example, that we'll have the fastest growth this year, you move on to a different statistic. As I say, I'm not sure this really adds a great deal to the wealth of knowledge.
But the wealth of knowledge is based on independent data. That's the only thing we can have reference to in terms of your performance. Are you refuting now the OECD's economic outlook as well as the ONS and the OBR?
I'm simply saying I didn't come here, although I will for the next attendance, seeing how you run your committee, with a set of figures to debate about the size and scale of the economy as opposed to some of the industrial issues and energy issues facing us. I will come armed with those numbers for the next occasion. As you know and I know, you can quote many different organisations, including OECD, IMF, the OBR, the ONS, and come up with a range of different projections. And I fear you're being selective in your range, and that, as I've pointed out several times, off the top of my head, I'm able to quote some alternative figures. On a slightly more constructive note, I don't think we're that far away in terms of an understanding of what needs to happen, which is we need to have faster productivity and faster growth. And there have, of course, been a range of headwinds, including a global pandemic and a war in Europe, which, yes, has an impact on different countries in different ways.
You don't seem to want to have a discussion based on data around the performance of your department in terms of economic growth. But when you arrived as Secretary of State, you did a little video for your Twitter account from the round lifts where you called the business department, quote, the Department for Growth. So if you're uncomfortable with me using all of these statistics on growth, how would you like me to measure your performance as the Department for Growth?
I'm not uncomfortable about it at all. And as I pointed out, we will have the fastest growth in the G7 this year. But when your clerks listed a range of issues that you wanted to discuss at this committee, that wasn't included, and so it's not a brief that I've come armed with, and I'm telling you what I recall off the top of my head.
Okay, just for future reference, it shouldn't be a surprise that I'd like to talk to you about the economy, but now we know.